She didn't know I was standing in the hallway. That's the part I keep coming back to. Even now, months after everything fell apart and came back together in a way I never expected. She didn't know I was there. And if I had walked 3 steps faster, if I had gone to the kitchen through the other door, I never would have heard any of it. My son might have married her, and I would have stood at the altar in my good suit and smiled like a fool while a stranger robbed my family blind. But I did hear it, and what I heard changed everything. It was the Saturday before Thanksgiving, and I had driven 4 hours from Asheville to Charlotte to spend the weekend with my son and his fiancée. My son is 34 years old. He works for a mid-sized architectural firm downtown, does well for himself, and has his mother's laugh and his grandfather's stubbornness. He called me in September, voice cracking a little the way it does when he's trying to sound casual about something that matters, and told me he'd proposed. She said yes. He said, "Dad, I think she's the one." I wanted to believe him. I wanted that more than I can explain. His mother passed 6 years ago. Ovarian cancer, caught late, gone in 14 months. After she died, it was just the two of us, rattling around in a grief we didn't know how to share. He threw himself into work. I threw myself into the property 38 acres outside Asheville that my father built a life on, that I spent 30 years adding to, that I always assumed would pass to my son and his family someday. We didn't talk about feelings much. We talked about football and home repairs and whether he was eating enough. That's how we managed. So when he called about the engagement, I told him I was happy. I told him I couldn't wait to meet her properly. And I meant it. I'd met her twice before that weekend. Once at a restaurant in July, once at a birthday dinner for a colleague of my son's in August. Both times, she was charming. Warm smile, sharp eyes, the kind of woman who asks you questions and actually seems to listen to the answers. She had this way of touching my son's arm when she talked to him, like she was always making sure he was still there. I thought it was affection. I understand now it was something else entirely. That Saturday, I arrived around 2 in the afternoon. My son met me at the door with a hug and a cold beer, which is his version of a red carpet. His fiancée came in from the kitchen, kissed me on the cheek, said she was so glad I made the trip. She'd made chili. The apartment smelled like cornbread. I set my bag down and thought, maybe this is going to be okay. Maybe this is exactly what he needs. We had dinner together and talked about the wedding. They were thinking April. Outdoor ceremony, small guest list, maybe a venue out near Lake Norman. She had opinions about flowers that I absolutely could not follow but nodded along to anyway. My son watched her talk and had this look on his face, open, unguarded, the way he used to look as a kid watching a thunderstorm from the back porch. Not scared, just completely absorbed. After dinner, my son went to take a shower. He had an early call the next morning with a client overseas and wanted to get to bed at a reasonable hour. His fiancée said she'd clean up. I offered to help, but she waved me off and told me to relax, to help myself to anything in the fridge. So, I settled into the armchair in the living room with the TV on low and a second beer going warm on the side table, and I drifted a little, the way you do after a long drive and a heavy meal. I woke up to her voice. She wasn't in the living room. She was in my son's study just around the corner, door not quite closed, speaking quietly but not quietly enough. I don't know how long she'd been in there. I don't know what woke me, whether it was a particular word or just the tone of her voice, which was nothing like the warm, careful tone she used at the dinner table. This voice was flat, efficient, the voice of someone conducting business. I didn't move. I barely breathed. "He has no idea," she said. "None. He trusts me completely." A pause. "The property is the real asset. His father is sitting on 38 acres outside Asheville." I looked it up. It's been appraised at over $2 million. The son doesn't have much liquid, but once we're married and I'm on the accounts, we move fast. Another pause. "I know what I'm doing. Just be patient." I sat in that armchair for a long time after the call ended. I heard her come out of the study, heard water running in the kitchen, heard the soft sounds of someone finishing dishes, and I sat there with a cold beer in my hand and the television talking to nobody, and I thought about my son's face at dinner. That open, unguarded face. I have never felt rage and grief at the same time, as clearly as I did in that moment. It was like being pulled in two directions hard enough to tear something. I didn't confront her. I want to be clear about that. Because a lot of men my age would have. I'm 63 years old. I spent 31 years as a structural engineer, and the first thing I learned in that profession is that you do not make a move until you understand what you're actually dealing with. You do not pull a wall down until you know whether it's load-bearing. You assess. You plan. You act when you have what you need. So I finished my beer. I went to bed in the guest room. I lay on my back in the dark and listened to the apartment settle around me and thought about what I'd heard, turning it over the way you turn a piece of timber to look for rot. She had been researching the property. She knew the acreage. She knew the appraised value. She had someone on the other end of that phone call, someone who was waiting, someone she was coordinating with. She had a plan. And my son was not a partner in it. He was the mechanism. In the morning, I had breakfast with them, said my goodbyes, and drove home to Asheville. I did not tell my son what I heard. Not yet. I need you to understand why. My son is not a naive man, but he is a trusting one. His mother raised him to believe that people are mostly good until proven otherwise, and I have never had the heart to argue with her, even now. If I had walked into that kitchen Sunday morning and said, "Son, your fiancé was on the phone last night, planning to take everything we have," he would have looked at me the way children look at a parent who has said something embarrassing at a party. He would have been gentle about it, patient, and he would not have believed me. I needed proof. Not a gut feeling, not a half-heard conversation, not the word of an old man who drove 4 hours and fell asleep in an armchair. I needed something real. I have a friend from my engineering days. We worked together for almost 15 years before he retired and went into private consulting. He's not a private investigator. He's better than that. He spent 8 years doing fraud auditing for a federal contractor, and his mind works like a filing system. I called him on Sunday night and told him everything I remembered from that phone call, word for word, as best I could. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "How long have they been together?" "About 14 months, I told him, and she knew the acreage and the appraised value. "Yes. That's not something you learn from a conversation," he said. "That's research. She's been doing her homework for a while." He paused. "Let me make some calls. Don't do anything yet. Don't change anything. Act normal. Act normal." I have replayed that instruction many times since then, because what followed was 6 of the most difficult weeks of my life, and every day of them required me to act as though everything was fine. I called my son on Sundays as usual. I asked about the wedding planning. I asked whether they'd looked at venues. I listened to him talk about her with that particular softness in his voice, and I said, "That's great, son. Sounds like it's all coming together." It was the hardest acting of my life. Meanwhile, my friend was working. He has contacts I don't fully understand in networks I don't fully understand. And within 2 weeks, he had begun to put together a picture that was worse than anything I had imagined sitting in that armchair. Her name, her real name, not the name she used, showed up in a civil court filing in Georgia from 4 years earlier. A man had sued her for recovery of funds transferred to a joint account that was subsequently emptied. The case was settled out of court. The man's attorney, when my friend reached him, said only that his client had been significantly harmed and had chosen to move forward. There was a name attached to the settlement agreement as a co-respondent, a man in his late 30s, address in Atlanta. The same name appeared in a business registration in South Carolina. A small investment holding company, registered 18 months earlier, listed as the sole officer. She was engaged to my son. Her co-respondent from the Georgia lawsuit was running a company in South Carolina. I want you to think about that for a moment. My friend also looked into her credentials. She had told my son she was an independent interior designer, showed him a portfolio website, mentioned a few clients by name. When my friend dug into the website, it had been created 14 months ago. The client names either didn't exist or, in one case, belonged to a retired woman in Tennessee who had never hired an interior designer in her life. The portfolio images were lifted from a design firm in Portland, Oregon. She had built an entire identity to stand next to my son. By early December, my friend put a folder in my hands, printed documents, screenshots, a timeline. He sat across from me at my kitchen table and walked me through all of it. I asked him how confident he was. He said he was confident enough to send it to someone who could do something about it, but that the choice was mine. She hadn't broken any law against my son yet. The engagement was still on. There was still time. That night, I drove out to the edge of my property, the far corner where my father planted a row of white oaks 70 years ago, and I stood there in the cold and thought about what to do next. I could go to my son. I could put the folder in his hands and let him read it, and watch his face as everything he believed about the woman he loved rearranged itself into something unrecognizable. I could do that, but I had been thinking about what my friend said she hadn't broken any law against my son yet, which meant the moment she knew she'd been discovered, she would simply leave. No consequences. She would move on to someone else. That man in Atlanta would help her build another identity, and she would do this again to someone else's son, someone else's family. I didn't want to just save my son. I wanted to stop her. So I made a decision that I have not regretted, though it cost me something. I will explain in a moment. I called my son and told him I wanted to do something special for Christmas, rent out the private room at a restaurant in Charlotte, invite a few of his close friends, celebrate the engagement properly. He was surprised and touched. He said she would love that. I said, "Good. Let me handle all the arrangements. You two just show up." I also called an attorney, not to ask him anything about criminal matters that wasn't my lane, but to ask about something the most liked comment on a video I once watched had planted in my head months before any of this started. Separate property. Assets owned before marriage. Inherited property. I had 38 acres that had been in my family for 2 generations. I wanted to understand exactly where I stood. My attorney was very clear. In North Carolina, property owned before a marriage is considered separate property and is not subject to equitable distribution in a divorce, provided it has not been commingled with marital assets. An inheritance, similarly, remains separate property regardless of when it's received. The land was mine. It would remain my son's when I left it to him, not hers. She had done her research, but she had gotten the law wrong, or she was banking on my son not knowing it. Either way, I wanted to know the terrain before she did. I also, very quietly, contacted the attorney who had handled the Georgia civil case. He couldn't tell me much, but he told me enough. And he gave me the name of an investigator who had worked that case, a woman who, when I called her, recognized the name of the co-respondent from the Atlanta filing immediately. "That situation is still being looked into," she said carefully. "At a federal level." I told her what I had. She asked me to send it to an email address she gave me. I did. 2 days before Christmas, I flew my son's college roommate in from Seattle, surprised my son's best friend from high school, and reserved the back room at a steakhouse in uptown Charlotte. I bought wine and ordered good food and hired a photographer to take pictures. I did everything a proud father does to celebrate his son's happiness. She sat across the table from me all evening and smiled and accepted toasts and talked about the wedding. She was exactly what she always was, warm, attentive, convincing. She touched my son's arm. She laughed at the right moments. I watched her and I thought, "You are very good at this." And I thought, it ends tonight. After dinner, when the photographer was packing up and the friends were saying their goodbyes in the foyer, I asked her if she'd walk with me for a moment, just to the far end of the room, away from the others. She said, "Of course." And she smiled, and she had no idea. I placed the folder on the table between us. I didn't raise my voice. I am 63 years old, and I lost my wife, and I have spent 6 weeks holding this quietly, and I had nothing left in me for theater. I just told her what I knew: the Georgia filing, the co-respondent in Atlanta, the fake portfolio, the overheard phone call. I told her I had already been in contact with people who were interested in all of it. She was very still. Then she said, "You can't prove any intent. This could all be explained." I said, "It will be. In court. Or not. But either way, it's done." She looked at me for a long moment, and then the warmth went out of her face the way a light goes out when the power cuts instantly, completely. She was someone else entirely for just a few seconds. Then she picked up her purse and walked out of the room. My son came back from the foyer and looked at the empty chair where she'd been sitting. He looked at me. I had the folder still on the table between us, and I slid it toward him. That conversation took a long time. It was the hardest conversation I have ever had. He read the documents, and then he read them again, and then he asked me several questions, and I answered them as clearly and honestly as I could. He didn't shout. He didn't leave. He sat across from me at that table with the remains of the celebration dinner around us, and he processed what he was reading the way his mother used to process bad news, slowly, thoroughly, with a particular stillness that meant he was working very hard to hold himself together. At one point, he put the folder down and said, "How long have you known?" I told him. 6 weeks. He said, "Why didn't you tell me right away?" I said, "Because I didn't want her to walk away clean. And because I needed you to see proof, not just hear me." He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I'm angry at you for not telling me." I said, "I know." He said, "I also understand why you didn't." We sat there for a while longer, and the restaurant staff came in and began quietly clearing the table around us, and neither of us moved to stop them. Eventually, my son put his elbows on the table and pressed his palms against his eyes the way he used to do as a little boy when he was trying not to cry. And I put my hand on his shoulder and didn't say anything, because there was nothing to say. I want to be honest about what came next, because people always want the clean version of a story like this. The neat revenge, the villain punished, the hero vindicated. Real life is messier than that. She did not go quietly into the night. In January, she tried to contact my son several times, a mix of anger and explanation and what seemed designed to look like remorse. He didn't respond. She contacted his firm once, which was a mistake, because my son's employer takes professional matters very seriously, and that phone call ended with a strongly worded letter from their legal department. The man in Atlanta, the one with the holding company, was, as the investigator had indicated, already the subject of a federal investigation for wire fraud and financial crimes. I don't know exactly what information I provided helped or in what way. I only know that in late February, his attorney reached out to my son's attorney. Yes, we had both gotten attorneys by then, with what amounted to a request for my son to provide a voluntary statement about his relationship with her. He did. His attorney was with him. In March, the man in Atlanta was indicted. I won't say more than that because I'm not a lawyer, and I don't want to misrepresent a process I only understood from the outside. What I know is that she was named in that indictment as a co-conspirator. My son and I drove up to the property in early April, the 38 acres, the white oaks, the old house his grandfather built, that I've spent years slowly restoring. We hadn't been out there together in almost 3 years. We walked the fence line the way my father used to walk it with me, and we didn't talk much, which is how we've always communicated the things that matter. At the far corner, where the oaks are oldest, and the light comes through in long, late afternoon slants, my son stopped and stood there for a moment, looking out across the ridge. Then he said, "I really thought she was the one, Dad." I said, "I know." He said, "How do you know when you're wrong about someone like that?" I told him the truth, which is that sometimes you don't. Sometimes you only know because someone who loves you was paying attention when you couldn't afford to. We walked back to the house and I made coffee and we sat on the back porch the way we used to when he was in college and would come home for breaks. He asked about a section of the fence that needed replacing. I told him I'd been waiting for spring. He said he'd come back in May, and we'd do it together. I don't know how to end a story like this in a way that makes it feel resolved, because honestly, it isn't. My son is fine. He's working, and he's careful, and he's started going to dinner with a woman he knows through work. Nothing serious yet, and he sounds, on our Sunday calls, a little lighter than he did in January. That's real. That matters. The property is still there. The white oaks are still there. My son's name is still in my will, exactly where it has always been. What I think about most, in quiet moments, is not the woman or the man in Atlanta or the indictment or any of it. I think about my son's face at that dinner table, reading those documents. Not the anger, not the shock, what came after that. The stillness. The way he looked at me when he finally put the folder down. He didn't say thank you. He didn't need to. Some things between a father and his son exist below the level of language, in the same place where a 6-year-old reaches up without looking because he knows the hand will be there. I am 63 years old. I have buried a wife and outlasted a career and walked a fence line that my father walked before me. I don't have many illusions left about the world or the people in it, but I have my son, and I have those 38 acres, and I have the particular satisfaction of a man who looked at something broken and took the time to understand it before he decided what to do. She thought she was marrying into a family that didn't know how to protect itself. She was wrong about that.